Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the open mic. I am your host, Rich Eisen. As you know, every week I talk to writers and editors and agents and folks in the publishing industry about writing and the writing world. Um, I'm really thrilled today to be joined by a writer that I've only recently become familiar with her work, and I'm really excited about it. Gaby Triana, how are you doing, Gaby?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here. I love your show. I've watched
Well, that's
several
great.
videos already.
Hey, I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear someone say they really like the show. Um, Well, as I say, I'd like to really. I wish I had read everything so I could ask you a lot of all-encompassing questions about all of your work. But as I say, this is one of the great joys of doing this. Is I often get to uh, get familiar with writers whose work I have not experienced before. So this is really very exciting for me. I want to talk to you though about your latest book, Moonchild, because I've just gotten and just really started getting into it. And I'd like to say I've read some of your other work. Uh, I read it described as the craft meets the shining. That is one of the great pitch lines I've ever heard in my life, and super intriguing. So tell me a bit about Moonchild and how accurate is that description?
It's pretty accurate actually. It takes place in a haunted hotel. It used to be a haunted hotel slash hospital slash mental institution because a lot of the buildings here in Florida do change over time. And it's about a Catholic 18-year-old from a very Hispanic Catholic home, very traditional, who sets off on her own after a fight with her family and comes to discover like-minded kindred spirits and in this hotel, and she hangs out there with them and learns a lot about them in the hotel and about herself in the process. So yeah, it is kind of like she meets her coven. And but the haunting, even though there's a lot going on in the hotel, is from what comes from within her and from within her past is what's haunting her, which is, I feel, how it should be in most haunting novels. I love stories about ghosts, but really the ghosts are just there as, for me, I think, symbol to bring out whatever it is that the main character is going through at that time, what it is, their internal conflict that they're dealing with.
Well,
So yeah.
you've written quite a few books, and you've ghostwritten quite a few books, which we'll get into that a little bit later. But I wanted to ask, what draws you to horror and dark fantasy and ghosts and the supernatural? What is it? What's the appeal there for you that drives you to write so many of these books?
I I don't know. I can just say that I have been fascinated since I was a kid. I think it started with a record, an LP that someone gave to me as a gift when I was about 7 years old. And this was before I was reading picture books and chapter books, but I hadn't been introduced to anything dark or spooky. And it was a record called Famous Ghost Stories. I think it was narrated by I think his name was Wade Denning. He was a commercial actor, and he had developed the jingle for Maxwell House, the Maxwell House jingle in the 50s. Anyway, he narrated all the stories on this record. And as a kid who had a little bit of trouble finishing books and having a little bit of ADHD as a kid, I found listening to these records and to these stories to be so immersive, and they were so spooky, and they were all Edgar Allan Poe tales, Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, The Bloody Tower, just all those sort of, old school American and British folk tales. And I just loved it. And then as a kid also, I loved Scooby-Doo and anything that had to do with castles and ghosts, and my love for Halloween because I was born in October. And it just morphed. And so by the time I was, not even 14, I was reading Stephen King, and by 18 I had devoured all of Anne Rice, and it just sort of went from there. I've always been into the spooky and the gothic.
Yeah, Stephen King is a great gateway drug. If when you hit your teens, if you read The Shining or The Stand or something, which is what I did, and then you're
Yeah,
hooked. You either don't ever want to read another one ever again, or you want to read every one you can ever
right.
get your hands on.
Right.
There's
That's
no
where
sense
my
in
one of
being.
my teens is at right now. He's in the middle of devouring the whole Stephen King canon. But
That's
and
a good one.
someone asked me, "Is it what's one of your favorite middle grade novels?" I said, "Well, it." She's like, "That's not a middle grade novel." I go, "You want to make a bet it is?" I mean, it's all about what's going on in these middle schoolers' lives, and yeah, it ties in their adult life too. But just hand it to a kid, and you'll see, even with its inappropriate parts, like how immediately they latch on to these stories, and Carrie as well. So yeah, yeah. So
Well, you know what? That's a great lead into. I wanted to ask you about. So you've written 17 books, and I noticed that they're labeled for teens and adults, is how they're described. Um, you know, do you consider yourself though primarily a YA author, or are you really intending to write to be accessible to all ages?
branding has always been Achilles heel in my career. I don't really I kind of stopped caring a few years ago where I fall and where I'm labeled. I'm just writing stories, and whoever it appeals to, it appeals to. Although I used to identify as a YA author, but a lot of what I'm writing these days is adult based, or new adult. Moonchild is considered what's considered new adult, which for anyone who doesn't know is main characters are anywhere between 18 and 21, 22, having adult experiences for the first time. So it doesn't really classify as YA, but it turns out that a lot of my YA readers are reading it anyway. So I'm not gonna go and put any limits on it. So whoever it appeals to. I like to think of myself as a gothic suspense author. I always have been, even though that's not where I started out in publishing. I started out in YA contemporary, what was called back then chick lit, and I don't even know to this day how I fell into it. Except that I wrote something to impress my critique group, and then they loved it so much I sent it in, and it became a 2-book deal with HarperCollins. And from that point on, I was writing YA chick lit. I'm like, I'm a horror author. We have to correct this. So I've been steadily over the last 20 years just making my way back to my love, which is the dark fiction.
Yeah, you mentioned the branding and pigeonholing in so many ways is really, I think, a fair term as well. I ask writers about this often who, um, you know, want to maybe in their they've made their bread and butter in the mystery genre or in more straight tech thrillers or something like that, and then they want to try something different, and it's difficult for them to, even if they've sold a lot of books and been successful, it's sometimes very difficult for them to even get their own agent to represent something different because the industry really wants to keep you in that thing where you're selling books.
Yeah.
You know, how has that played out for you? I mean, did it take you the full 20 years to try to transition out of maybe what they wanted you to be to how you're feeling about it now?
Yeah, it's been slow and steady. I'm with my second agent. I was with my first for 10 years, and he was really insisting that I stay with what was working. Paranormal is out. You don't want to be writing that. And, he was looking at the market and what was selling at the time. And I understand that. But, um, there's a lot to be said for writing what's in your heart too. And for trusting, if you're an agent, for trusting your writers and letting them go where they want to go, because that's where the best stuff is going to come out of. And I felt like I was living a lie. I kept telling him, I can do this. It's not that I can't. It's just it's not where my heart is. And he understood, and we parted ways. And then so my new agent has been a little bit more open and letting me explore that territory. So yeah, and she represents children's, middle school, YA, adult. She kind of you know spans that spectrum. So I'm very lucky to have her.
I want to ask you about YA because YA has really grown in popularity in recent years, and we both know authors that are pretty much known predominantly as adult authors who also have YA series. Some of whom you wouldn't even think of, right? Do a lot of YA. Why do you think, or what do you think has spurred this growth in the YA genre?
I I think it's just a branding thing. It's just, I know that when I was growing up, it was just picture books, chapter books, and then adult books. And that's it. If you were in high school, you were reading adult books. There's a sort of aesthetic that I think is very popular. Women on the cover, empowered women on the cover. That just is something that just appeals to the YA audience, which is primarily female. So, you know, if you do it right with the right covers and the right lighting and the right photography and everything, you know, you can build a brand and be writing, just churning out books for years and years, and avid readers are there. They're just there to just consume them.
Mhm.
I've never been a series writer. The Haunted Florida series is the closest I've ever come to writing a series, but it's not a dynamic series. It's just a standalone series. All the stories take place in the same world, but in the same environment, the same setting, but not necessarily the same character across
Right.
timelines. So yeah,
That's
I
interesting.
don't know what, I really don't, that's a good question, but I don't know what has contributed to it, except that there's some really strong branding powerhouses out there in YA publishing. And what they do really well.
What makes for a compelling story for you in the YA genre, or and then what are maybe some of the parameters that someone who might be looking to write in this genre should be aware of? Is there are I mean, how steadfast are the rules? I guess you know what makes for something that's compelling, and then maybe again, what are some of the things that you know a newbie would really want to be aware of if they wanted to get into it?
Authentic voices is probably one of the biggest draws right now to YA. Is they're doing a really excellent job with the hashtag own voices and the diversity in YA publishing. So if you have a unique point of view, or you come from a certain culture or a certain experience that is that is true to you, and you can lend that sort of that lens to, they're looking for you. So keep that in mind. And if you're not from a certain culture or subset, it gets to be a little bit harder. Other genres are more forgiving of that, but in the YA world, they're really just looking for right now own voices. So if you whatever, and that doesn't have to pertain to culture or nationality or race or anything, it can, but if you have a specific viewpoint, you know, if you grew up in a certain part of America, if if your parents owned a chain stores or whatever, anything that you can lend your expertise or your knowledge to, and mention that in your cover letter and in your query letter, they're more apt to pick those up and look at those, because that's what they're looking for right now.
I'm glad you touched on that because I wanted to ask you about diversity because I know there was some controversy in previous years about the maybe the lack of diversity or you know books that were being written with cultural undertones by people who didn't come from those cultures, and so you know I think it's really a positive thing to see the industry because I think in other genres certainly the mystery writers would tell you that it's definitely not quite like that in the mystery world. They're still really struggling to get that same footing. So it sounds to me very encouraging that maybe there has been some growth and some advancement in that area, so that there is more awareness of, you know, of things like own voices and diversity.
Right. And which is a wonderful thing. And I do think that the YA community is doing a really excellent job. They're kind of like just taking the lead with that. And I think all the other industries and genres are learning a lot from them, which is great. Like the second story in my Haunted Florida series is written in the point of view of a Miccosukee woman, which I am not Miccosukee. And the whole time I was writing it, kept thinking I would never be able to get away with this if this was a YA novel, because the first thing they would tell me is, you don't have the unique viewpoint to write this. They're very much about protecting, what's put out there and making sure that kids are given, only those unique viewpoints, and we don't have that so much in horror. But I think the next best step and the next best thing is to make sure you're doing your research and doing it really, really well. And when possible, meeting with people of that culture and doing your research and speaking with them and getting to know, everything that you possibly can and absorb and even spend time with them, and make sure you have. Now, the Miccosukee are a very, very, very small group of Native Americans in South Florida. There's only about 250, 200 to 300 members of Miccosukee of South Florida. So I spent time with them. And I also have, having grown up here, I have a couple friends who are from the tribe. And, you know, I had their full blessing. And so that's the only thing that made me feel comfortable writing in that point of view. But if you're writing YA, you have to be just really, really careful and make sure you have sensitivity readers, read your stuff, you know, thoroughly, and just lend it as much credibility as you can.
Right. You're not only a writer of ghosts, you're a ghost writer, and a very successful one. I actually had to do a double take. You've ghostwritten more than 50 novels. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Mostly in the romance genre, because romance books, you know, once they find a good ghostwriter, you're basically hired for life. And if what you produce is really resonating with audiences, you're just there, and you're given 5, 6, 7 books a year. And so there was a point from 2013 to maybe 2018 where I was just churning them out constantly, because romance readers are avid readers, and they're just they just suck these books up literally. Like, they read them in like a day or two, and okay, when's the next one? I gotta write it. So yeah, the work was steady, and it was there for a solid 5, 6 years. But I have written across all genres. It's just that I would say probably 80% of the books I wrote during that time were romance.
How did you get into that? I know people who've ghost. Oh, okay, so I'm a political reporter by trade, and I caution everybody who's ever read a political book: if you think the politician wrote that book, you're somewhat delusional.
Right.
But how does someone get into, whether it's writing for romance or any other genre? That would seem to be a little more challenging.
It started out kind of slowly. Back, let's see, 2012, there was a website called Elance, which is now Upwork, and a lot of writers find it's kind of like a Readsy, where you can, get an account and put your resume up there and see what small jobs you can find. And I was going through a divorce. So I was basically like looking for anything. I really needed to just, make any money that I could at that time. So I started with editing, and then the editing turned into rewriting passages. Can you rewrite this chapter for me? And then that turned into partial ghostwriting, and where I would get sent a full manuscript that's a rough draft, and basically, can you boost this? Can you spruce this up and make it sound better? Can you make the sexy scenes sexier? Can you make the banter more fun? And what can you add to this? And from there, little did I know that that's kind of like an audition process for a lot of the the publishers that put out ghostwritten content, so IP material and such. So yeah, and then before I knew it, I was just, do you want to write the whole book? So, and then yeah, it was just a gradual introduction to it, and before you know it, I had the gig. I didn't even really want the gig, but I was like, you know what, I'm getting paid for this is fantastic. I can pay my mortgage. I'm keeping it.
Yes, there's nothing wrong with getting paid. That's not a bad thing.
Right.
You also write short stories, and what's the best thing about writing short stories for you? And I ask because I've had writers tell me a variety of things. That they use them sometimes as a way to get out of a writing slump. They can put away their big project that's killing them and kick out a short story, and it gets the juices flowing again. Others, it's a way to address a subject that maybe they don't want to do the big project on, but it's a nagging idea. What is it for you that can, is it the most enjoyable part about writing short stories?
So I'm still figuring that out, because I'm new to short story writing, but I'm coming to find that what I enjoy the most is that I can get to the good part like immediately, because the short story is really just like the ending chapter of a longer novel. We just, we skipped all the development and got to the climax, to the good part. And so, yeah, I agree with what you said and what other writers have said. I can just basically skip ahead and fast forward and just get to that. And there's something, there's something, I was gonna say primal, but it's not primal. It's just it harkens back to the days of when you first started writing, or when I first started writing. Usually, when writers first begin, they don't start with novels. They start with assignments in school and in class. And okay, today you're gonna write a short story, 1,000 words, go. And you just have to rely on just what you have at that moment. And there's something just exciting about it. There's no planning to it. You know, I do a lot of thorough planning with my novels, and with short stories, I can just, okay, I have a basic idea. Let's just get started. You know, I can get right to it. So it's a little more immediate, a lot more immediate.
Well, you mentioned assignments in school, and I wanted to ask you about this because um, every writer that I have ever talked to, when I ask them, how did you, come to do this? 99.9 of us percent of us will say, well, I've always loved to write. I wrote as a kid. It's like you have it in you. But so many people struggle later on, not just to do the writing, but to even acknowledge and say, I'm a writer. There's something, it just seems that it's so difficult about that. It's almost like, not that people are ashamed of it, but it's like we feel like there's this giant high bar. And if we haven't crossed
Yeah.
that, then we don't get to call ourselves writers. Why is it? Why did you experience that too? And if so, why is it so difficult for us to consider ourselves writers?
I don't know, but I encounter a lot of writers with imposter syndrome, and I do get imposter syndrome when I'm writing out of genre. Do I ask myself, am I the best person to be writing this? Like I haven't really attacked this genre yet. Maybe I shouldn't be writing this, you know, and I get that in my head, but we doubt ourselves a lot. We want people to like what we're writing. And I find that it's not just writers. I find that across the board, creative people tend to doubt themselves, but maybe that's what keeps us going. Maybe if we were all cocky and loved what we did, we wouldn't push ourselves further. Um, but yeah, I know we constantly compare ourselves to others, but I've been learning over the last 10 years just not to do that. Like what I have is unique. I have a unique viewpoint, and I'm just going to go with it, and I'll find an audience no matter what. You know, when you get into like trying to impress people, and you know, some people like to have someone in mind when they're writing, like I'm going to impress this person, you know, you're just going to fall flat on your face, cuz what if they don't like it? You're going to stop writing. So
Right.
yeah, I know, I don't know what causes it. But it is what it is. I don't,
Well, it sounds like you've
do you
overcome
have an idea? Because I would want to know.
that. I don't know. It sounds like you've overcome it.
Oh no, why are
You're
we
doing
like
pretty
that?
darn well.
Yeah.
Um, you know, uh, you also mentioned school because I understand you taught third and fourth grade for 7 years. I
Mm.
know you've also had your own cake designing business. I'm always impressed. That's the other thing. In any writer's background, nobody comes out of school and becomes a writer and goes on to be successful. You're a longshoreman, or you trap bears in the Kodiak or something. There's always something that writers do
I
that builds
know.
up this big resume, and it never seems to coalesce with actual writing words.
Yeah.
How is that your background helpful to you in what you're doing? I mean, those are very disparate things, and none of them are being a gothic horror writer for a
No.
living.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I went to college. I graduated with a bachelor and a master's in elementary education, which I only used for like 10 years. And I used that time mostly to just study what would become my target audience. So I love the kids, and I just didn't know who I was back then. It just took me a while, even though I had been writing in middle school and high school, and I had been winning awards, and the signs were there. Like I'm a good writer. At some point, I should probably write something longer than, a few pages. But it wasn't until I think it was my fifth year teaching fourth grade that I would read to the kids every day. Every day, that was our morning routine. First 40 minutes of the day, the administration would tell us not to spend more than like 10 minutes on bell ringers or anything in the morning. Get right to the work, and all the data driven. The school is very data driven now, but I was like, well, what about just reading? These kids don't have anyone at home. A lot of them at schools where I taught don't have anyone to just read to them. So I did spend a lot of time reading to the kids. And the more I read, and we would read like 10 books a year, and the kids would be just listening, just wrapped in their attention, just like, they think they're so cool when they're older, like fourth, fifth grade, but they're not, they're babies, of course. And they love to have someone read to them. And when I was reading to them, I thought, you know what, I can write this, I can do this, I can do exactly this. And so that's how I started. And my first full-length novel was a middle grade novel called Freddie and the Biltmore Ghost, it's unpublished, but that's how it began. And from there, I started looking for a critique group, and SCBWI, the Society of Children's Books Writers and Illustrators, a local group. And that's where I found my YA voice. And then I ended up volunteering for the group for the next 15 years. But then things, life happens. 2008 to 2014 was a very rough time, economy wise, and also just at home, and with my marriage and such. So I went through sort of a transition. I had to fend for myself. I had to rely upon just whatever talents I had in order to get through and pay bills and such. And so another thing that came up during that time was cakes, because I was always into decorating cakes from like the time I was 15 through 20 something. It was a fun hobby. I said, well, I'm gonna have to turn this hobby into a job now, because I really need to rely on it. I don't have any other skills. Like, these are my skills. I either make this work or I don't, because I can't go back to college and learn something new at this point. So I got to make it through writing or through baking. So I did. I had a cake business for 2.5 years that actually did really well. But it was, for me, always just a stepping stone to getting back to the writing, which was I had started, and I had to step away from it in order to, make more money. So, but I look back at the cakes that I've made, and I must have made about over 1,000 cakes during that time. And I love it. That time period helped me to become super disciplined, helped me to rely on just things that I didn't know. I was just pulling skills out of myself that I didn't know I had. And it just taught me to be resilient and have hope that things would turn around and make something out of nothing. And that's what I did. I made something out of nothing.
It's really impressive, and again, I think it really is in line with, like I say, what I think a lot of writers. One of the reasons writers often do develop later is because you do learn discipline, and you do learn about deadlines and all those things. But I think so often we have to pull, as you say, you pull things out of yourself you didn't know you had. Mm-hmm. Maybe because you have to, or maybe because the time is right. But I admire it. It's a Thank you. A lot of people don't get there in their life, so kudos. I have a couple more, but one thing I really want to ask you. How do you handle rejection? Because this is a business that is built on rejection. So much of any creative endeavor, and most creative people, if 9 people tell you something's brilliant and one person tells you it's crap, you're gonna obsess about the one, right? How do you handle rejection? How do you handle things that are challenging to you in that regard?
I just move on. I don't really I allow myself to feel disappointed. I don't sweep it under the rug or anything, because I really felt this editor was really going to connect with this story. But no, I just move on. There's so many editors out there. There's so many. I know that what I've written is going to find a home with someone. So it's never been much of a roadblock for me. I don't allow that to cripple me to the point that I just don't write anything else. It's a job, and rejection is part of the job. So if you can't, handle the rejection, then you got to examine what it is about yourself that's, that's letting that cripple you, because it's just like any other job where you're not gonna hit the 100% mark every time. And this is so subjective. It's just such a subjective industry that you can't let just one sign just stop you. So I just keep going. That's it. I just keep moving, keep submitting to other editors, and always keep writing. You know, I know a lot of writer friends who write something and they just put all their hopes and all their eggs into that one basket. And you know, you have other stories to tell. I know you do. You know, just keep moving. Yeah, don't give up on it. Keep it going, keep submitting, but in the meantime, start something new. And you never know, it might be that second and that third and that fourth story that really hits and resonates with a publishing, you know, house, and not so much the first one. I mean, my first novel wasn't published, so imagine if I'd, you know, just kept with that and not written anything else. So
Right.
yeah, just keep moving.
Well, I like to wrap things up on what I intend to be a fun question. I hope is a fun question. Um, let's just say that I had the power to put you together for a conversation with any one of the following three people. Tell me who you would choose and why. And the options I'll give you today are the Charm City Cakes owner Duff Goldman, who's considered America's #1 cake designer,
Mhm.
Frankenstein author Mary Shelley, or the Halloween movies Jamie Lee Curtis, of course known for much more than that, but of course for your purposes, Halloween. Any one of those people, Duff Goldman, Mary Shelley, or Jamie Lee Curtis, I can get you together with one of them. Who would you choose, and why?
Oh my gosh, that's a hard question. Oh my gosh. Um, hmm. You know, I would say Duff Goldman. I would say Duff Goldman because I would want to talk about longevity. Not that Jamie Lee Curtis doesn't have a longevity. Her career's been amazing, but I know that it wasn't easy for him at the beginning. I would want to know more about kind of like what you asked me, like how did you build a career out of this, and you know what kept you going. And I would want to share just shop talk, you know, all the cake stuff, and because I don't have anyone to talk to anymore when it comes to that. I feel like that's another lifetime that I lived. So I would probably want to talk to him. I watched all his episodes and I loved what he did with cakes. It was just so creative. He was putting, you know, just like fireworks and bombs and stuff coming out of his cakes and doing all sorts of amazing like turntable cakes that moved and using electronics and just breaking barriers and just super creative. So I love talking to other creative people. So I would, yeah, Duff Goldman.
Duff Goldman it is. Wow.
Yeah.
Uh, I really appreciate it, Gabby, you taking some time and talking to me today about all this. I think you've offered writers not only an insight into your work, but a lot of really helpful thoughts and advice on how they could address their own career. And I really appreciate that a lot. Um, if you haven't already, please check out Gabby's work, Gaby Triana. You can find her on her website and anywhere else. And in the meantime, if you haven't done it already, please hit the subscribe button below because there's a lot of good folks on this channel. I hope that will help in your writing pursuits or in your reading pursuits. They're both very worthy. And until next time, I am Rich Eisen, and
Thank
this.
you so much for having me. This is great.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I really appreciate you being here. So see you all next time.